Three propositions. First of all, climate is everywhere, right? And A, it's a given. That's why we choose whether we are going to wear a sweater or not. But it's literally everywhere. I was looking at your bios and I was thinking, okay, who is here who doesn't deal with climate? And my answer is no one. If you teach international negotiation, you cannot escape the climate diplomacy. If you're teaching agriculture, international trade, international finance, international health, and that is a major difference, right? If you're teaching security, this is front and center, right? Which doesn't mean other things have been displaced, but you no longer have to make a case. Your students will make that case, right? And therefore, the world where a few people like myself were the climate people has to be now replaced by the world where everyone, no matter what you are teaching in international affairs, will have to know and talk something about climate, because that's what will be on the front pages. But I say this not as a climate person, but as an IR person in how the field has changed. And it is one of the few issues that has moved from the periphery to the center of the global conversation. The second one is I'm going to make this proposition that in some ways what's happened between Rama's story and mine is that what started as a science issue has become a political issue. Whether leaders believe in it or not is not what I'm saying about. They cannot escape it. They cannot not pretend that they take it seriously. Science is now the distraction. And everyone understands this is a political issue, this is an economic issue, this is a societal divide issue. And that's why it is taking that high politics. And that is true in developing countries even more so. And the third is this thing that I've been talking about for a few years, which is that we are now living in the age of adaptation. And that's where the developing countries come in, right? Mitigation, adaptation, two key concepts. Mitigation is what do you do to keep a problem from happening? Adaptation, how do you adapt to the problem when it happens? The point that at Kyoto, even Copenhagen, was how do you mitigate? How do you keep the problem was happening? Well, we failed, right? Adaptation is the failure of mitigation. Mitigation was entirely about carbon. It was carbon management, right? So the way most of us talk about climate is how do we manage the carbon molecule? Because the more carbon that, I'm simplifying it, but it really is simple in that sense. It was managing carbon output so that climate doesn't happen. The world we are now, where 1.5 will not be met, no way, no how, we can do a bet right now. What that means is the world now knows that we will have to adapt. Now, what happens in an adaptation world, and I'll just end with this. What that means is in an adaptation world as educators, we are no longer talking about carbon, because carbon doesn't adapt. We are talking about everything else that happens because of climate change. And the biggest chunk of that is going to be water. It is water. So when you will talk about climate, we will essentially be talking water. Think about what happens when climate changes. Much of it is about water. What happens when climate changes? Water rises, sea level rise. Water melts, glaciers. Water disappears, drought. Water falls from the sky like no one's business, right? So water is the language of climate impacts. And that is where developing countries come in, because in the age of adaptation, if I am half right, the north-south dimension of climate as a common problem comes up much, much more, right? Because then the story is who caused this and who's going to pay for it, as opposed to let's all hold hands, Hakuna Matata, and solve the problem itself. Where this becomes a major, not only political issue within countries, but issue of confrontation between countries saying, hey, I didn't cause this, but now I have to put real money into it. This is not a future issue, right? You're already seeing that. If you saw Glasgow, the big thing was about this mythical 100 billion. And that's what the 100 billion is about. Climate is going to be talked about in justice terms domestically, locally, and internationally. And it's going to be talked about more and more. And that's going to make the international politics more difficult. And that's also going to make the domestic conversation much more difficult. I am not, as Rama said, net zero is not zero. And I think there are some fights coming around it. Boston is going to go net zero. How is it going to go net zero? A lot of it is going to be by exporting our pollution elsewhere. You go to any city, there are neighborhoods which are very rich, and you always wonder, how is it that the people who are creating the most waste live in the cleanest places? That's because their waste goes somewhere else. Now you extrapolate the same thing globally, and that's part of, that model tells you what the justice issue here is. Our footprints within this country, amongst countries, are very different. Right? And that's the J problem. That's the J problem. This is this set of issues about justice that have come to the fore. Climate is and will remain a major part of that. And this is the globalness of the issue, right? This is one of the most truly global issues of all times, because it can't be solved on the assumption that if every country does what is best for them, that will magically add up to what is best for everyone. Right? That's the conundrum. That formula doesn't work.